Hello and welcome to the very first event of our Share Life speaker series, Caring for Our Mental Health. We decided to launch this initiative because we all know that mental health has been a huge issue for many of us over the course of this pandemic. And the agencies that Share Life funds, many of them deal precisely with this topic. I'd like to now introduce Elizabeth. Elizabeth has been working with Catholic Family Services of Durham since 1996 after having obtained her Bachelor of Social Work from King's College, University of Western Toronto, and her Master of Social Work from the University of Toronto. Elizabeth started her work at the agency as a frontline therapist, providing family, individual, and couple and group therapy, and was promoted to executive director in 2010. I hand it over to you.
So great to be here with you this evening. I understand that this is happening at the same time as a major hockey game. And so it's quite a sacrifice if you're sitting here with us this evening. And my hope is that maybe some of the things that we talk about will be helpful for you as you deal with the stress that the big game could potentially be causing later on this evening. So welcome to all of you. We're going to just spend some time talking this evening about caring for our mental health. And, I think that as a society, we have really always struggled to give mental health the respect that it deserves, because unlike physical health, which we're really clear about the importance of, it has really been hard for us to raise mental health to the same level of importance in our society and give it the same value that we do physical health. You can even just think for a second about how easy it is for someone to talk about needing to go to the doctor, or talking about requiring some physical therapy or some kind of other physical health care, and how hard it is for people to talk about when they have the need for some sort of mental health professional, whether it be a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a social worker or therapist. The reality is, over the past, even I'd say 10 to 15 years, we've been really working hard to try and take away the stigma that comes from mental health and try to make it as normalized as talking about physical health. Bell Let's Talk Day is a perfect example of how we as a society are trying to change the conversation and make it be one that is open and inclusive and supportive, as opposed to stigmatizing. The reality is, 1 in every 5 Canadians will struggle with a mental health issue at some point or another in their lives. And during the pandemic, some experts have suspected that it's probably closer to 1 in every 2 people. So if you think just about the 1 in 5 statistic, that in the course of a lifetime, 1 in every 5 people will have a mental health issue, that means 4 out of every 5 people know someone very personally and closely who has or is or will struggle with a mental health issue. So this is something that is relevant for all of us. One study actually found that only 1 in every 3 of those people is going to reach out for support. Imagine what that would be like if in our physical health care, only 1 in every 3 people went to the doctor when they had cancer or diabetes or some other serious issue. And yet we somehow think that it shows strength if we pretend like we don't have a mental health issue and then we don't get help for it. And that can be really hard on us, and it can actually make things more difficult. So there are some myths that we tend to believe about mental health. And so I'll get you to change the slide. Thank you, Chris. So here are some common myths about mental health. The first one is that it's not a real illness. So there's a lot of people who believe that this is something that you can just make go away in your mind because it occurs in your mind and your feelings. That is a myth. It is a real thing, mental health. Mental health issues will never affect me. They might not affect you, as in you might not be the person who is experiencing the mental health issue, but you will know someone over the course of life who has a mental health issue. So it will affect you. It affects us all. Mental health issues are just an excuse for poor behavior. This one is such a common one, where we accuse people of blaming their laziness or their lack of performance or their lack of friendliness on a mental health issue, instead of us saying the mental health issue is a legitimate reason for that person to be struggling. Bad parenting causes mental health issues. So this is the classic thing where we like to blame mom and dad for everything that happens to people, instead of being willing to accept that it is a real thing that people struggle with mental health issues. Now, it's true, if you've been abused by a parent, then that can cause you to have anxiety and depression. In that case, yes, that is bad parenting, and it could cause a mental health issue. But there are many children growing up in loving, wonderful homes with fantastic parents who struggle with mental health issues because that's their biological makeup, and it has nothing to do with parenting. Number 5, people with mental health issues are violent and dangerous. I forget the exact statistic, but the truth is people with mental health issues are actually more likely to be harmed than they are to harm somebody else. The problem is that our media loves to tell the sensationalized story about the person struggling with a mental health issue who does something dangerous or violent, but they don't report all of the people who are wonderful contributing members of society who have mental health issues. So we only hear in the news about the occasional rare, violent, or dangerous person, which is not more prevalent than the average person. Number 6, people don't recover from mental health issues. This is such a sad, mistaken myth. There are definitely severe issues that some people can struggle with from a mental health perspective, just like physically. But there is so much help out there for people who have mental health issues, and people are able to really learn how to cope and get stronger and feel better despite what they might be struggling with from a mental health perspective. It is not a life sentence of doom. People with mental health issues are weak and can't handle stress. I would like to suggest to you that instead, someone who has to live every day with a mental health issue is strong. It takes so much strength to get up in the morning and go through the day when you have this extra thing that you have to fight against. And so just because somebody is struggling, it doesn't mean they're weak and that they can't handle stress. And we'll talk a little bit more later about where this mistaken myth actually comes from when I talk a bit more specifically about coping strategies. People with mental health issues can't work. If that's the case, we'd have a very small workforce. If you think about how 1 in every 5 people has a mental health issue, there are wonderful contributing members of society out there who do have mental health issues. We can absolutely do both, work and work on our mental health. Number 9, kids can't have mental health issues like depression. These are adult problems. The unfortunate truth is that kids can have mental health issues like depression. And it's not because their parents are terrible parents. It's because it's a thing. There is a biological fact associated with mental health issues like depression. And sometimes there are external factors, like if there is bullying or learning difficulties, or there has been some sort of victimization external to the child that can impact a child and lead to something like anxiety or depression. You do not have to be an adult to struggle with this. And then number 10, everyone gets depressed as they get older. It's just a part of aging. That's a depressing thing to even think about being truth, and it is not truth. It is not a life sentence that as you get older, you are going to be depressed. But oftentimes there are things happening to people that can make them struggle as they get older. But it is not a fact that you get depressed for sure just because you're older. There are lots of very happy people who are loving retirement and enjoying not being young anymore. So if you can put on the next slide, please, Chris. So I'm going to show you a video now. I'm going to set this video up by warning you. It's not a well done video at all. It is a video meant to highlight how sometimes we put really unrealistic expectations on ourselves and on people that we know who have mental health struggles, whether it be depression or anxiety. And so I'm just going to warn you up front, it's not a well done video. And there's times where I think it must have been a teenage boy who produced this, because there is a scene where there's someone hanging over a toilet pretending to be sick to their stomach. And I wish I could edit that part out, but I can't because I'm not technologically savvy that way. So please offer me a bit of grace as you watch this. Watch it taking in the message, which is, what if we talked about physical health the absurd way that we talk about mental health? Please play the video.
And I was like, yeah, right, man. Oh, my head.
Please don't complain. It'll ruin the vibe.
Just.
It's like you're not even trying to walk.
Have you ever tried not having diarrhea?
Oh my God, dude! I cut myself and it looks really, really bad.
Some people have it way worse than you do. You gotta chill out.
So I guess you're not going out with us tonight. Again.
Can you hold on 1 second?
Honestly, your attitude sucks.
You taking another insulin shot?
Yeah, I kind of have to.
Have you ever thought about dropping the pharmaceuticals and fighting this the natural way?
My diabetes.
Great, thanks, Chris. So those are things that people who struggle with mental health issues actually hear from the people in their lives. Seriously, are you going to complain again? You're wrecking the mood. Are you seriously not coming out with us again? You never come out with us. Can't you just try harder? Why do you need medication? You should be able to handle this on your own. These are things that are real things people hear, and it doesn't help. And it really sends a message that their mental health issues aren't legitimate and aren't valid. And they really are legitimate and valid. And they're things that are very common. And I would just want you to hear from me that during this pandemic, it has really challenged everybody. And there are many people who have already been struggling with mental health who are finding their struggle even harder because of the pandemic, and people who have never struggled before who are finding themselves wondering sometimes, why do I feel like I'm in this funk? What is going on for me that I feel like this? And so what I thought I would do this evening, because we only have a limited amount of time together, is talk about two of the most common types of mental health issues that we see showing up a lot in our counseling organization, and that's anxiety and depression. And I'm just going to walk through a bit with you how some of these things can show up, talk about some ways to cope, and some signs that it's time to get some professional support, just so that we can leave our time together tonight feeling like it's been relevant and really applicable to the world that we're living in right now. So anxiety, what is anxiety? Anxiety shows up inside of us in the form of physical sensations, in our behavior, in our emotions, and in our thought patterns in response to, in general, when there's something external that is happening that is signaling to us that there is some kind of danger and threat. But when we are someone who struggles with anxiety from a mental health perspective, we find ourselves feeling those physical sensations and engaging in behaviors, feeling emotions and thinking thoughts like there is a threat or a danger, but there isn't a threat or a danger. Oftentimes what we will hear from people is, I don't understand, there was nothing happening, and then all of a sudden I just had this wave of anxiety wash over me. That is what happens when someone who is struggling with an anxiety disorder or bouts of anxiety, that's what happens to them. There doesn't have to be an external threat for them to feel the feelings associated with that. So if we look at physical sensations, this might look like an increased heart rate where your heart is pounding really fast. It might be shallow breathing, so you're sort of like not taking a deep breath. It's a shallow breath, a tight chest where you feel like you're really tensed up in your muscles. Sometimes people report getting headaches or stomach aches or butterflies in their stomach. When someone feels like this, you can imagine the normal reaction when you feel those kinds of feelings is you feel like you need to withdraw and you need to kind of sort of protect yourself. And so oftentimes that's what people will do in response to anxiety. They will sort of bow out of things and they will withdraw because they feel like they need to protect themselves to cope. Sometimes you can tell someone's struggling or feeling anxious because they might start talking really fast, or they're jittery, they're shaky. And we may see this sometimes showing up in people wanting to avoid the thing or the situation or the place where they last experienced anxiety. Kids, you're probably hearing about lots of kids who are not wanting to go to school right now, or who are afraid to go outside, or who don't want to go to daycare. Oftentimes that's because they're feeling feelings of anxiety associated with a particular situation they might have had happen to them before. When we look at emotions, this usually manifests itself, anxiety, in things like feeling worried about something, dreading something, being panicky about something, fretting about something, or perseverating about it, meaning thinking about it over and over and over again, where you have these feelings of worry associated with it. And then that impacts the thought patterns that we have. So we will sort of obsess about a particular thing or try to figure out how to solve a particular threat that we think might be there, going over in our head a bunch of what if scenarios, scanning our external environment for threats because our body or our emotions are telling us there's a threat, or we think there must be a threat. Otherwise, why would I be feeling this way? And so we see these things show up, and it can create a real overwhelming feeling. Anxiety is not fun. Anyone who has struggled with anxiety will tell you it is not a fun thing to have to cope with, and it can be a real bother and really interfere with feeling like you're living your best life. But there are some strategies that we can use for coping. Before we get to those, if you could go to the next slide, Chris, I'll just highlight some times where it would be important to reach out for help with anxiety. Everyone here on this call could talk about a time when we felt anxiety, where we've had a bout of anxiety, where something has taken us sort of to a place of being stressed. But when that anxiety becomes something that causes a disruption in our everyday life over a period of time, and it keeps happening again and again, or it's getting worse and worse, that would be a time to reach out. When the anxiety we're feeling doesn't fit with something that would be considered normal. So for example, you're going to have separation anxiety when you're a 2-year-old. But if you're a 10-year-old and you're still having separation anxiety, or a 25-year-old and you're having separation anxiety, that's maybe an indication there's something going on that requires some extra support. And when that anxiety comes out, or it escalates in response to something, and so much so that the anxiety itself becomes a problem in addition to the problem that's already being faced, then that's a sign to get help. So as I said, there are many things that can happen in life that can cause us to feel anxious at time. But when our anxiety becomes its own thing to manage on top of the situations we're facing, that's when we know it's time to reach out and get a bit of help. If you could type to the next slide, Chris. So one of the things that is wonderful is that we can actually rely on our body to help us with our anxiety. And I fully believe that God has equipped us and given us ways within how He's created us to help us with coping. And although anxiety often shows up in the body, and people can sometimes feel like their body is their enemy because that is where they notice the anxiety, we can actually use our body to help us. So one thing you probably hear about all the time, and I'm just wanting to tell you that this also will apply for the depression piece that I'm talking about as well. So nutrition is really helpful when you're struggling with anxiety or depression. Our body needs nutrients, it needs water, it needs to be fed properly so that it can help us cope. And that is something that we can have control over, that we can do to ourselves to help ourselves. Activity levels is another really helpful thing when you're struggling with anxiety or depression. Getting exercise, it doesn't have to be, something extreme. It can be going for a 10 or 15-minute walk every day, getting outside. That is something that can change the way we're feeling, because it releases natural endorphins into our body that are actually natural chemicals in our body that are feel-good chemicals. And so doing something physical can help. You can do other things. If you don't like going for walks, you could do jumping jacks in your house, you could do sit-ups or push-ups, you could run on the spot, you could skip. There are all kinds of ways that you can create the release of those endorphins. Sleeping is something that is very helpful for both anxiety and depression. So oftentimes when we talk to people who are struggling, they will report poor sleep habits. So, you know, staying up really late, watching shows, trying to numb out. And so if you can pay attention to when you go to sleep and how you go to sleep and getting enough sleep, that can actually be something that can be really helpful in combating anxiety and depression. Breathing. I know this sounds kind of probably obvious because we need to breathe to live, but we can actually help ourselves, and especially when we're struggling with an anxiety attack, by the way that we breathe. So I'm going to get you to do this with me now. I'm going to get you to put your hand on your chest here, and I'm going to get you to put your hand just underneath your rib cage, just sort of where your diaphragm is. So when you are struggling with anxiety, deep breaths can be something that can be very helpful to calm the anxiety. And so what you would do is be breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. Why are your hands like this? Because a deep breath will make your lower hand, which is down on your stomach, go in and out. A shallow breath is going to happen up here on your chest where your hand is. So this hand you have here is not the hand that should move. It should be the hand that's down under your rib cage. So put your feet flat on the floor, get yourself comfortable, and we're going to take a deep breath in through the nose for 4. Ready? 3, 4, and then out through your mouth for 4. 2, 3, 4. Try that again, focusing on that lower hand being the one that moves, not the top one. Ready? In through your nose for 4. 2, 3, 4. And then out through your mouth for 4. 2, 3, 4. The longer you do that for, the more control you take over your body, and you actually force your heart rate to slow down. You force your muscles to begin to relax. Some people will combine that deep breathing with other things like playing music in the background, closing their eyes and picturing their favorite place that they like to go to. And doing that kind of hijacks your anxious response and gives you back the control by controlling your breath. The other thing that you can use when you're struggling with anxiety or depression to help you interrupt the thought patterns that can impact how you're feeling is your senses. So we have our 5 senses, right? Our taste, our smell, our sight, our hearing, and our touch. And if we use those senses, we can actually also help ourselves interrupt an anxious thought process or a depressed thought process by introducing something else. So we are physiologically wired that when we taste something, our mind registers the taste. So if you were to put something in your mouth that you liked the taste of or didn't like the taste of, your mind has to stop thinking about the negative thing or the anxious thing it's thinking about so that it can register, I just tasted something delicious, or I just tasted something terrible. We will actually often suggest to people that they pick a taste that can be a cue to them to stop thinking about the anxious or depressed thought process. So we actually use, many of you might know of this candy called Warheads, which are really super sour candy. And when you put a warhead in your mouth, it is really hard to think about anything else other than how sour that candy is. And as crazy as it sounds, it actually provides the opportunity for the anxious thought process to stop or the depressed thought process to stop, because you're so focused on how sour the candy is, which gives you a chance then to say, wait a minute, I don't want to go back to thinking that thing. Let me think of something new that is helpful, that is a little bit more life-giving, that isn't going to be so hard on my emotions. And you can do that with other things too. You could do that with a sound. If you have soothing music that's helpful to you, you could use a smell. So some people like to light a candle that smells really nice. Any one of our senses can be a helpful interrupter of the thought processes that are making us feel anxious or even more depressed. Chris, if you could pass to the next slide, please. So a couple quick things about depression that I just want to highlight for you. The depression that people feel oftentimes is classically described as this kind of persistent feeling of being sad, and it can really result in this sort of loss of interest or numb feeling that people have towards things in life that typically would have brought them joy. And when someone is feeling depressed, it will impact, just like depression, how you feel, how you think, and how you behave. And we can have something called situational depression, which is in response to a situation that's happened. So a lot of people are reporting feeling depressed for their first time ever during this pandemic. That's a situational depression. That's in response to this worldwide pandemic that we are facing. There are other people who have something we would call clinical depression, which is a diagnosis that is because they struggle with that sort of on an ongoing basis, regardless of whether the situation in front of them is positive or negative. And some of the coping strategies, or the coping strategies we talked about with respect to anxiety, would also apply to depression. If you could just turn to the next slide, please, Chris. It can show up, depression can show up in kids and youth, however, sometimes in a different way than how it presents for adults. So in children, you will see things like the sadness, but you may also see things like irritability and clinginess, and them talking about physical problems like aches and pains, as well as some of the school refusal that we talked about in the anxiety space. And with youth, we can also see a real escalation in moodiness and anger and poor performance, not wanting to get out of bed, a real sort of malaise coming over them that makes some of the struggles that youth have in general as they're going through that developmental stage that much more intense. And so when people are feeling these symptoms, and when adults as well as children and youth are feeling these symptoms, it can make them wonder, what's the point? I just feel like stuff is terrible and I just don't want to do it. I don't want to get out of bed. I don't want to clean my room. I don't want to wash the dishes. I don't want to take out the garbage. Who cares if there's food on the floor? These kinds of sort of loss of interest in all kinds of things that maybe used to be really enjoyable things starts to show up because of the depression. And so relying on our senses, relying on the coping strategies that we talked about a couple of minutes ago are also things that can be applicable, only instead of using them to try to help us feel more in control, those become the things that we use to make us feel more alive and interested again. So, you know, you might not be deep breathing to calm down the anxiety. You might be deep breathing because it gets you back in touch with your body and makes you feel alive and awake again. You might not be going for a walk because it helps you calm your heart rate. You might be going for a walk because it makes you start to feel sort of more energized and invigorated again. And still with depression, those endorphins being released is so helpful, as it enables us to begin to get back in touch with the things that brought us joy. And one of the things I would say is that when we keep feeling feelings of anxiety or depression on an ongoing basis, whether you're a child or a youth or an adult, over time, it can feel so frustrating because we can start saying things to ourselves like, what's wrong with me? Why do I feel this way? And so someone might be struggling with anxiety or depression, and you just might think they're grumpy or angry, when in fact what they are is not knowing how to cope with how they're feeling inside, and that's how it's coming out. So if I can get you to go to the next slide, please, Chris. which is why, if you remember nothing else than this evening, please remember this. Treat yourself like you would treat your best friend, nothing less. So often we are compassionate and kind and caring and gracious to the friends that we have in our lives when they are struggling, but we don't offer ourselves the same kind of kindness and compassion and grace. And yet that's in fact exactly what we need. And we need to start with treating ourselves like that so that we can begin to increase our ability to cope and survive, so that we can then eventually thrive again. And it's so important to focus on coping and to reach out for help, because we don't want to stay too long in that space of struggling, because over time it makes it harder to cope. The longer we cope, or the longer we're sort of in that negative space without coping, the harder it is to feel like we can tolerate what's happening before us. And so, Chris, if I could get you to go to the next slide for a second, because I just want to share this piece about our window of affect tolerance. And I thought I would use, I'm sure everybody has seen one of these windows before, where it can open from both the bottom and the top. So if you look at the picture on the left-hand side of the window where it is fully extended, both panes are fully extended. So if we pretend that's our window of affect tolerance, every human being in this world has a window of tolerance, which is basically, if we stay within that window, that's the sweet spot for us for coping. And if we find something happen to us that is too hard to tolerate, and it kicks us outside of that window of affect tolerance, that's when we'll find ourselves up here in the anxious place, or down here in the depressed space. And if we stay in that high anxiety or that high depression for too long, then over time, what that does is that pushes our window of affect tolerance smaller. And so if you see the picture on the right-hand side, you can see that there is less window, right? Because it's being squished together, which means it's going to take less the next time to make us feel too anxious or too upset or too depressed. And so the more we work on coping, the more we work on the things that we talked about earlier around caring for our mental health, the better we are able to keep our window at its maximum, so that we're able to sort of feel like we're staying level. And this pandemic, it already is pushing at either edge of our window of affect tolerance. So we all have this external thing pushing, trying to shut our window a bit. It's requiring extra effort on our part to keep the pains as separated as they need to be. So be kind to yourself. Be gracious to yourself. We can turn to the next slide, please, Chris. So here are some self-care tips. These sound like things that might seem obvious to you, but you'd be surprised how easy it is to forget to do these things when you're struggling. Take some time to do the things that you enjoy. Nothing is too small. Any little thing that you do that you enjoy for yourself matters, because it's sort of like a cumulative effect. Take care of yourself. Take care of yourself physically, eating right, sleeping right, brushing your teeth, brushing your hair, basic hygiene. And I'm not being facetious or sarcastic here. These things make a difference. They send a message to ourselves that we matter when we do them. Making self-care a priority is so important. And self-care doesn't have to look the same as it does for your friend. It's about saying, I need to take care of me because my life has value. And so I'm going to make sure that I do something for myself every day that matters. And it might be as simple as sitting down with a cup of tea at the end of a long day and putting your feet up for 15 minutes while you drink that tea. What matters is that you've decided, I'm going to do this for me, which might mean that you need to set some specific self-care goals. So if you run a fast-paced life, if you spend a good chunk of your time caring for everybody else, you may need to set aside some time this weekend figuring out, what do I need to do that is going to help me? What goals do I need to achieve in terms of self-care that will send messages to me that I am also important? And then make it a habit. So it says, I think the research is 21 to 27 days to form a habit. So give yourself a month to make this a habit where, you know, this thing or things that you've decided are going to be helpful for you become that for you, and then set boundaries to protect that. It is not selfish to say, no, I can't do this or this, because you know that would infringe on the time that you've set aside for you. You've probably heard the airline stewardess or steward say, put your own oxygen mask on before you help someone else put theirs on. The reason being, if you don't have oxygen and you can't breathe, you can't help somebody else. And it's the same with self-care. If you're not taking care of you, you will not be as good at taking care of others. And a few minutes is better than no self-care at all. Keep in mind, unhealthy activities don't actually count as self-care. And I'm not here to judge anybody. I think we all like to indulge in the treat, in an occasional treat, and maybe an extra glass of wine every now and then, those kinds of things. But if it is something that is detrimental to your health, then it is not self-care. And sometimes people will use self-care as the reason why they're doing those unhealthy activities, but that doesn't count as self-care. And even when you're feeling good, don't let it slide, because you're building up that sort of, remember we talked about how it's sort of a cumulative effect. So keeping it going even in the good times just means you have a reservoir to draw from in the difficult times. Okay, Chris, slide. And then lastly, please reach out for help. If you are finding that it is not just sort of a general thing, that there is, it's a struggle, it's becoming a thing in and of itself, there is no shame in that. It shows strength when you reach out for help. Thank you very much.
So now it's an opportunity for us to ask some questions. You'll notice on your screen on the right-hand side, there's the question and answer panel. Some of you have already submitted questions. Before we get to the questions from you, I actually have a question for you, Elizabeth. Many of the people who are participating in this webinar today are supporters of ShareLife. And what can you tell us about the impact of their support of ShareLife on the work that you do at Catholic Family Services of Durham? Because I think even though we may be here in this presentation thinking about how we can help ourselves with mental health, a lot of the people listening might not realize what they're already doing to help the mental health of others.
Well, at my agency, which specializes in working with people who are struggling with anxiety and depression, family, individual, couple counseling, and trauma work, we couldn't do our work with the people that we support if it weren't for the money that we get from ShareLife through Catholic Charities. So that's how it impacts everything we do, the therapy sessions that we provide. The information I've shared tonight is information that is shared with people in counseling sessions, and we couldn't do that if it wasn't for ShareLife.
First question that we have here. My son is suffering from unresolved trauma from about 5 years back. He is isolating, in depression, with some suicidal thoughts. He wants me to pay $300 a month to get therapy with Talkspace. He's 26. Is there anything less expensive or free? He lives on his own downtown. Would he qualify for YouthLink? Can you give me some more contact info? Thank you so much.
So first of all, I'm sorry to hear that your son is struggling that way. That is very difficult, and trauma and resolving trauma is a really a big task. And so I'm glad to hear that he wants to resolve his trauma. That will be very good for him to be able to do that. One of the things that will happen afterwards is that I have provided Chris with a bunch of resources that will go out, which have some additional links and pieces of information that can be accessed, that will give you some additional places to look at and some additional strategies and some additional resources. But in terms of what would be available, certainly, yeah, there are private places can be more costly. There are funded places as well. Oftentimes there's a bit of a wait list. I do know that Catholic Family Services of Toronto is a place that provides support and could be accessible for your son. I would recommend reaching out to see if they have an available trauma therapist who could assist there as an option.
I'll add to that, Elizabeth, that on the ShareLife website, we have links to all of the Catholic Family Service agencies that are located throughout the Archdiocese of Toronto, whether you're in Simcoe, Muskoka, or Peel Dufferin, or Durham, or York, or Toronto. So if you go to the ShareLife website, you can see at the very, very top, there's a link saying need help, and it has links to all of the agencies that are supported by ShareLife, including the Catholic Family Service agencies.
Perfect. And what you would need to know as well for us Catholic Family Service agencies, it is a fee for service, but if you can't pay, you don't pay. So the fee ranges, anywhere from $0 up to, I think it's probably about $65 or something. So it's certainly not $300 a session.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Elizabeth, and you're right. I think it's an amazing thing that thanks to ShareLife supporters, no one is turned away due to financial need.
Yeah.
So the next question here is, so seeking confirmation from something you said earlier, Elizabeth. So eating ice cream when feeling depressed or anxious is actually good advice? I'd like to know this as well. Because that is my go-to.
I knew there was going to be somebody who brought that up. So as I said,
feelings.
Yeah. So I am not here to judge anyone, and I do think there's an element of nurturing and comfort that can come from food. If you think right back to when you're an infant, you are comforted by your mother by being fed and nurtured that way. So I'm not here to speak against that. It's about when it becomes unhealthy for you, that it is not something that I would deem self-care, but I'm not about to judge anyone for the occasional bowl of ice cream, especially after a really hard day.
Next question, can you give an opinion of Talkspace? I'm not really too familiar with that myself, Elizabeth.
I'm not overly familiar with that either, so I don't feel like I can.
Okay, next question here. Who is an authority to diagnose mental disorder? That's a great question.
It is an excellent question. So a psychiatrist has the authority to diagnose. You have to have a medical degree to do that, and also a doctor, a psychology doctor, has the qualifications to make a diagnosis like that. So you would want to make sure that if you were seeing somebody who wanted to give you a diagnosis, that they did have the proper authority. So for us, as for example, at my agency, we are master's level therapists who are trained in treating things. And so we will often say to somebody, it sounds like you might be struggling with anxiety or depression. You should go see your family doctor if you are interested in getting a diagnosis, because we're not qualified to make a diagnosis, but we certainly can recognize when we see symptoms that would suggest that. So it is a medical professional who would be making that diagnosis.
And we've got one last question here. So if any of you are listening and you're thinking about writing a question, please do so now, because we're almost at the end of the questions that have been submitted, and then we'll be wrapping it up. So this is your last call. This question is, how do we avoid a negative opinion about ourselves?
Well, we could spend the next couple hours talking just about that question. That is a really good question, and it is a really complicated one for sure. So, I mentioned earlier treating yourself like you would treat your best friend. So I find that such a helpful filter to put things through, because when you're engaging with someone else that you care about, you're oftentimes so much kinder and more gracious to that person. And we're often way harder on ourselves than we are on other people. So that would be one thing I would suggest as a reflection point. So would I say to someone I care about the same things I'm saying to myself right now? And if the answer is no, then that's an indication that perhaps you're being too hard on yourself. There's lots of reasons why we're really hard on ourselves, and sometimes it's helpful to process those with a professional, because there can maybe be some deep-seated reasons why that is happening. But I would also suggest, if you're a person of faith, that remembering that you are loved by God and created by Him specifically, and so that in and of itself means that you have worth and value and deserve to be treated properly.
Next question here. This is a good one. As a therapist for Catholic Family Services, do you also suggest spiritual coping mechanisms? And that kind of links to what you were saying just there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you're asking how do we handle things in a counseling session, if somebody has faith as part of their life, then 100% we would engage in conversation with them that would include their faith and why that matters to them and what it is, how important it is to them, and what do they use within their faith expression to cope. Absolutely, but we certainly don't force somebody to consider that if that is not something that they have identified as important to them. We sort of take our lead from the client, but absolutely, I encourage spiritual. Personally, I encourage tapping into your faith to cope. And one of the things I provided to Chris is a list of verses from the Bible that talk about how God is there for you and how you can rely on Him and how He will show up for you and fight for you and care for you. Because as people of faith, we do also have that available to us and can count on that and rely on having God with us as we cope with the struggle that we are facing. And certainly reaching out to, if you're attending a parish, reaching out to your priest who can be instrumental in speaking into that spiritual counseling piece as well.
And that will be among the resources that we'll be sending to everybody who registered for this event, along with the video of the event. So you'll have access to that. We'll be sending that out likely tomorrow. Question here, how do I know if I need a psychiatrist or a psychologist? Or maybe I can even add into that counselor.
So that's a very big question too. So what I would say is that it depends on where you're accessing the support that you need. So if you are looking to talk to somebody, to process what's happening for you, to learn some coping strategies and tools, then I would suggest that you seek out a therapist, either a master's level therapist or a psychologist. There are certainly, with psychologists, there are ones that will clearly identify if they do therapy or if they do something called psychometric testing and assessments. So if that's what you're looking for, to talk and process, then I would say a therapeutic psychologist or a therapist. If you are looking for medication, if you're looking for a diagnosis, then that would be where you would go to a psychiatrist. There are some psychiatrists who will do talk therapy, but most often, at least in our region, the psychiatrists that people see on a regular basis more do that sort of medication monitoring and referral and diagnosis, and then it's the therapists who do the actual treatment.
At Catholic Family Services, is virtual online therapy available during this COVID season?
Yes, and I can actually say that for all of the Catholic Family Services in the Archdiocese of Toronto, therapy is happening for the most part virtually, unless it's not feasible for someone to access the support virtually. We are essential services, so if it had to happen in person, then it could. But all of the Catholic Family Services have worked very hard to transition to virtual work right now so that it can be done on the phone and via video conferencing securely.
And how do they go about signing up for this? What is the best way to register
for therapy?
Mm-hmm.
So you would contact whichever organization is in your area, and each of the Catholic Family Services has their own intake process. So it would depend on which Catholic Family Services you are reaching out to. But most, I think I can safely say that all of them will have a get help or a how to get help section on their website that you can just go to, and it will give you specific instructions on how to access their services.
Fantastic. So that is all the questions that we have received, Elizabeth, and I want to thank you so much for this presentation. I think that the information that you have provided is really invaluable. It's we're going into our second COVID summer, and it's still going to be a tough, long haul for many of us. So I think that this information will really help us through this COVID season, as it was mentioned, and also, you know, what you said about treating yourself like you would treat your best friend. I found that really resonated with me, and yes, if we can all remember that, then I think that we'll certainly be in better shape.
Great, thanks. It was a real pleasure to be here. I hope all of you have a nice evening, and for those of you that are watching the game, go Leafs, go.
Thank you to everybody who joined us. We were really thrilled at the amount of participation that we had. There will be another event. This series will continue. We are going to be bringing in a speaker in June, and we will be emailing everybody with the information about that. And one last thing, I want to thank everybody who has contributed to the Share Life Parish campaign. As Elizabeth mentioned, support of Share Life allows the Catholic Family Services of Durham and all the Catholic Family Services agencies to do what they do and ensure that nobody is ever turned away due to financial need. So we thank you very much for your contributions to the parish campaign, which is ongoing. And if you would like to contribute to Share Life, you can do so at our website at sharelife.org/donate. Thanks everyone again for joining us. Be well and God bless.